1942. Machinist mate Albert Knack pressed his face against the chilly window of a PBY Catalina flying boat and observed fog rolling over the desolate slopes of Akutan Island in the illusion chain. Lieutenant William had been navigating by dead reckoning for an hour due to dense weather conditions that obscured their visibility even at close range. Their intended patrol area was near Dutch Harbor, but they were uncertain about their exact location until Knack spotted the Shumagin Islands through a brief clearing in the clouds. Now, as they flew over Akutan, taking the shortest route back to base, Knack noticed something significant: dark shape in a grassy valley half a mile from Broadbite. An upside-down airplane with its tail in the air and unmistakable Japanese markings could be seen clearly from their altitude. It was an intact Zero fighter, the aircraft responsible for American losses at a ratio of 12-1 over the past 6 months. They circled twice to confirm what they had discovered. The plane appeared almost undamaged, sitting perfectly still in the marsh grass as if waiting for them. They marked its position on their map and headed back toward Dutch Harbor without knowing that this find would become the most valuable intelligence asset of the entire Pacific War. The aircraft held secrets behind Japan's air superiority since Pearl Harbor. However, retrieving the plane from Akutan Island and bringing it into American possession would demand 3 recovery attempts spanning 2 months, along with a level of secrecy that could mean life or death in aerial combat for the next 2 years. 6 months earlier, on December 8, 1941, Japanese forces had struck the Philippines with overwhelming force. Within 1 week, 37 American pilots had lost their lives. The Zero fighters appeared out of nowhere, faster than anything previously encountered by U.S. forces, and far more maneuverable than what seemed physically possible. They could climb at an astonishing rate of 5,000 feet per minute and execute tighter turns compared to any American fighter maneuvers. Their operational range exceeded 1,500 meters, allowing them to provide bomber escorts far deeper into enemy territory than anyone had anticipated. These aircraft were flown by pilots who had been preparing for war since 1937 and were seasoned combat veterans from China, where they claimed 99 Chinese planes shot down while suffering only 2 losses due to ground fire. American intelligence agencies heard rumors about this fighter but dismissed most of them as exaggerations. Reports out of China spoke of an aircraft with remarkable capabilities, yet many commanders believed these claims were overblown. Training manuals depicted Japanese planes as inferior copies of Western designs, inexpensive and poorly constructed. These manuals proved incorrect. On December 7, 1941, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, the first wave included 78 Zeros. American fighters that managed to take off found themselves at a significant disadvantage. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk couldn't match the Zero's climb rate, while the Brewster F-2AA Buffalo struggled to outmaneuver it. Although the Grumman F-4F Wildcat was more robust, it was slower and less agile than its Japanese counterpart. Engaging in dogfights with Zeros often resulted in fatal outcomes for American pilots. In the skies above the Philippines during those initial weeks of conflict, American airmen endured harsh lessons. Captain Jesus Vilmore, piloting an outdated P-20 shooter, narrowly escaped destruction by diving away at full speed when faced with incoming Zero fighters. Lieutenant Randall Keaton scored the first confirmed kill against a Zero on December 8th, but lost 11 aircraft from his squadron that same day. Meanwhile, 18 P-40s parked on Clark Field's runway were completely obliterated by Japanese bombers upon their arrival. The aircraft never took flight. By January 1942, the official American strategy was straightforward and demeaning. If you spotted a Zero, flee immediately. Dive downward and use your heavier plane's superior dive speed to escape combat. Avoid engaging in turns or climbs with it. Just run away. Even this approach often failed. In February 1942 over Java, Allied pilots flying Hurricanes and P-40s repeatedly clashed with Zeros. The casualty rate was staggering. For every Zero shot down, the Allies lost 10 planes. On February 19, 1942, in Darwin, Australia, a single Japanese raid involving bombers and Zeros destroyed 23 Allied aircraft. The Zero appeared unbeatable. Returning pilots spoke of it with awe, marveling at its ability to turn swiftly and climb rapidly. Some even claimed the Zero had no significant drawbacks. However, one individual refused to believe that the Zero was invincible. In early 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch was in charge of Fighting Squadron 3VF3 based at San Diego Naval Air Station. His career as a pilot began in 1930 and included roles such as test pilot and gunnery instructor. He gained recognition for his tactical acumen, often spending evenings devising combat scenarios using matchsticks on his kitchen table to simulate aircraft formations. In the spring of 1941, Thatch received an intelligence bulletin from the Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin dated September 22, 1941, detailing the capabilities of a new Japanese fighter known as the Zero. The report highlighted its exceptional maneuverability, rapid climb rate of up to 5,000 feet per minute, and tight turning radius, features that outmatched his own Wildcat aircraft. Determined to find an effective countermeasure, Thatch dedicated numerous evenings to studying possible tactics. Traditional American fighter formations consisted of 3 planners, a leader with 2 wingmen flying in line astern, a formation used since WWII. However, he realized this arrangement forced pilots to focus too much on their leader and not enough on potential threats. To address this issue, Thatch introduced a new tactic involving 2 plane elements. Each element comprised a leader and a wingman flying side by side, maintaining a distance equivalent to the Wildcat's turning radius. 2 such elements formed a division of 4 planes. When one element encountered enemy fire from a Zero, both would turn towards each other. The Zero pilot, aiming at one element, would suddenly face 2 Wildcats approaching head-on or be vulnerable to an attack from the other element if he broke off. Thatch referred to this defense positioning as the beam defense. His crew referred to it by another name, yet they still conducted the practice. In May 1942, Thatch arranged for aircraft with superior performance compared to Wildcats to simulate attacking Zeros during training exercises. The beam defense tactic proved successful in every single practice session. Attackers failed to secure clear shots, while defending Wildcats consistently managed to attain firing positions. However, this strategy had never been tested against real Zeros until Midway. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led a squadron of 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers on an assault towards the Japanese carrier fleet located northeast of Midway Island. As the commanding officer of Torpedo Squadron 3VT3, Massey's mission was to strike the enemy carriers. Thatch and 6 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3 were tasked with providing aerial cover, flying at 500 feet above the torpedo bombers to shield Massey's group from Japanese fighter planes. However, upon initiating their attack run shortly after pseudo 800 hours, a squadron of 20 Zeros emerged from the sun and began attacking the formation. Thatch's section, comprising himself, his wingman ensign Robert Dibb, Lieutenant Brainerd McComber, and ensign Edgar Bassett, attempted to intervene. Almost immediately, Bassett's Wildcat was struck by a Zero pilot who fired into his fuselage. The aircraft nosedived towards the ocean and exploded in flames. Thatch then ordered Dibb and McComber to follow him as they executed the beam defense maneuver. The Wildcats turned toward each other, with Thatch positioning himself defensively for McComber while Dibb stayed close behind as the Zero pilot bore down on him head-on. Thatch prepared to make his move regardless. He pulled the trigger, unleashing a 3-second barrage from his 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon. The shells tore through the Zero's fuselage, tearing pieces off its body. Flames engulfed the Zero's engine as it spiraled downward, trailing behind it a plume of black smoke. This marked Thatch's first kill with the beam defense system. However, there were still 19 more Zeros to contend with, and only 3 Wildcats remained in action. Dibb reported that he had a Zero closing on his tail. Turning toward him, Thatch maneuvered into position just as Dibb swung around to face the threat head-on. Their paths intersected briefly before diverging again. The pursuing Zero attempted to follow Dibb through the turn and inadvertently flew directly into Thatch's firing arc. Another burst from Thatch's guns struck the enemy aircraft squarely, causing it to shed part of its engine cowling and ignite in flames. This marked Thatch's second kill. They continued to weave through the air, evading incoming attacks every 20 to 30 seconds. At regular intervals, their coordinated maneuvers placed one of them in a favorable position for a deflection shot against an approaching Zero. Makoma was unable to communicate over his damaged radio. However, he maintained formation and followed the turns dictated by Thatch's lead. 3 Wildcats managed to endure 70 minutes of relentless combat against 20 Zeros. Thatch claimed 3 confirmed kills, while Dib shot down 1 enemy plane. 1 Wildcat was lost during the engagement, and Massey along with all 12 Devastators were shot down as well. Not a single torpedo struck their targets. During this intense battle, Massey perished, as did his wingman. Every pilot in the squadron met their end. The beam defense tactic proved effective when properly executed by pilots who understood and practiced it, but most squadrons had no knowledge of such techniques. Even with success, American pilots were merely surviving rather than emerging victorious. To improve their performance, they needed to comprehend not only tactical maneuvers, but also the weaknesses of the Zero. They required detailed information about its high speed capabilities, rolling ability, and handling under negative G-forces. Actual flight data from an intact Zero was essential for this understanding. Meanwhile, during Thatch's fierce aerial battle at Midway, another Zero piloted by Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga was destined to crash on a nearby island located 500 meters north. Born on September 10, 1922 in rural Japan, Koga was the son of a carpenter and stood at just under 5 feet tall. Despite his small stature, he had successfully completed flight training and joined Carrier Iwo, flying Zero serial number 4593. The aircraft, which had been manufactured by Mitsubishi Nagoya on February 19, 1942, was barely 3.5 months old at the time of its demise. On June 4th, Koga took off from the Ryujo alongside a pair of other aircraft. His squadron leader was Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo, while his fellow pilot was Petty Officer Tsugu Shikada. Their objective was Dutch Harbor, a naval facility located on Alaskan Island in the Aleutian chain. This raid was intended as a diversionary tactic during the Battle of Midway, aiming to lure American forces away from the main theater of operations. The Japanese strategy involved drawing U.S. naval assets northward while their primary carrier group attacked Midway Island from the west. It was a deceptive maneuver designed to confuse the Americans into believing that a major offensive would unfold in the Aleutians. Koga's team struck Dutch Harbor shortly after 008 3000 hours, engaging in strafing runs and bombing operations against American targets. The base had minimal defenses at the time. However, the U.S. military responded vigorously with their available resources. Members of the 206 Coast Artillery Regiment used 50 caliber machine guns to fend off the Japanese attackers. Sailors aboard ships in the harbor also contributed to the defense by firing their own weapons. Bullets whizzed through the air, with only a few successfully hitting their marks. During one of his runs over Dutch Harbor, Koga's Zero sustained multiple hits from small arms fire, likely 50 caliber rounds. One bullet severed his primary oil line, which connected the engine to the oil cooler. With this crucial link damaged, the aircraft would soon lose all its lubricating fluid within minutes. As Koga watched, the oil pressure gauge on his instrument panel began dropping rapidly. He noticed oil trailing behind his plane, creating a dark streak in the sky. His engine temperature continued to climb. In just 5 minutes or less, the engine would seize up and cause him to crash. He radioed his section leader and flew southwest toward Akutan Island, which had been designated by the Japanese as an emergency landing site for downed pilots. A submarine was positioned offshore to pick them up. The island featured a long, flat, grassy valley roughly half a mile inland from the coastline. From above, it seemed ideal for an emergency landing, a long stretch of green that looked smooth and solid. Koga circled the valley once more. His engine was now running rough, With temperature climbing and oil pressure nearly gone, he had at most 2 minutes before the engine would fail completely. Shikada, his wingman, flew alongside him. On their second pass, Shikada spotted something unusual. The grass reflected sunlight in an odd way, revealing a shine that caught his eye. It dawned on him it wasn't solid ground, but rather a bog hidden beneath knee-high grass. Shikada tried to signal Koga to make a belly landing. Maintain the landing gear. However, Koga's engine was faltering. With both the flaps and the landing gear already deployed, he had no choice but to proceed with the wheels down touchdown. There wasn't enough time to make any adjustments. Shortly after the assault on Dutch Harbor concluded, his tires hit the grassy surface. The plane instantly sank into the muddy terrain. As it continued forward, its wheels became more entrenched in the soft ground. The tail lifted upward as momentum caused the aircraft to flip over abruptly, splattering mud and grass everywhere. It ended up resting upside down, with its engine submerged in the mire. Koga remained secured by his harness while hanging inverted inside the cockpit. His neck snapped due to the violent deceleration when the wheels encountered the muddy patch, leading to immediate death. Shockwaves from the impact had jerked his head forward with lethal force. Meanwhile, his wingman circled overhead, witnessing the crash and noting how Koga's plane flipped over before coming to a halt in an inverted position. Koga's whereabouts remained unclear. It wasn't known whether he lived or died. According to strict directives from their superiors, Japanese pilots were instructed to obliterate any downed Zero aircraft on enemy soil. These instructions were unequivocal. The wreckage had to be strafed and burned until nothing was left that could potentially benefit the Americans. Throughout the war, American forces had been eager to obtain an intact Zero for analysis, but each recovered plane had been too badly damaged to provide useful information. This particular wreck appeared nearly undamaged except for its inverted position. Should Koga still be alive inside, strafing would undoubtedly end his life. Despite careful observation, Endo and Shikada detected no signs of movement or life from the wreckage. After circling the area for several minutes in vain hope that they might spot any indication of Koga emerging, they reluctantly concluded he was likely deceased. With a submarine waiting off the coast, time was running short. Fuel levels were low, and American aircraft could arrive at any moment. The assault had concluded, and it was imperative to return to their carrier, the Ryujo. Faced with these constraints, Endo and Shikada made their decision. The pilots chose to leave the aircraft intact and return to their carrier, aware that they had not adhered to their instructions. They understood the ramifications of their actions and recognized that an undamaged Zero in American possession would be detrimental to Japan's war efforts. However, they could not bear to harm their comrade. This act of kindness and its human element altered the trajectory of the Pacific War significantly. For 36 days, the crash site remained untouched. Akutan Island is one of Earth's most isolated locations, characterized by its barren volcanic landscape often shrouded in mist. The Aleutian Islands are renowned for their harsh weather conditions: rain, fog, strong winds, and extreme cold. Koga's plane went down in a valley that was not visible from regular flight paths, making it impossible for passing ships to spot the wreckage due to obstructed views caused by the terrain. Throughout June and into early July, the Zero slowly sank into the marshy ground. Despite continuous rainfall and foggy conditions, much of the aircraft remained intact thanks to its inverted position. This orientation shielded parts of the plane from environmental damage, particularly the engine and cockpit areas. On July 10, 1942, Lieutenant William This and his PBY crew discovered the Zero by sheer luck. They had become disoriented in the fog and only stumbled upon the wreckage when they decided to fly overland instead of circumnavigating the island. On July 12th, a recovery team headed by Lieutenant Robert Kerms was dispatched to evaluate the situation on site. After arriving at the coastal area, they trekked half a mile through rugged terrain before reaching Koga's crash site. There, his body remained strapped inside the cockpit in an inverted position. With utmost care, they extracted him and discovered that his neck had snapped. It was evident from its unnatural angle. Due to the lack of a chaplain, they proceeded with burying Koga in a makeshift grave on a nearby hill overlooking the valley, providing what amounted to a proper funeral under the circumstances. They placed stones at the gravesite as a marker. Following this somber task, Kerms and his team examined the Zero aircraft thoroughly. A careful inspection revealed that although there were some minor bullet holes from the Dutch harbor attack, the airframe itself remained largely intact, and the wings exhibited no significant damage. The vertical stabilizer had bent during impact but was otherwise undamaged, and the tail section stood straight without any serious deformities. Notably, the engine appeared to be in good condition despite the crash. The three-bladed Sumitomo propeller was visibly bent due to the collision, yet it seemed repairable. Additionally, the landing gear had been sheared off when the wheels got stuck in a bog during the impact. The rudder was twisted, the wingtips were scraped, and the flaps were damaged, yet surprisingly, the aircraft remained in relatively good condition overall. This Zero was still capable of flying. Kerms promptly returned to Dutch harbor to report back. The Navy acted swiftly by sending a salvage team equipped with heavy machinery. However, nature proved to be an obstacle as the ship transporting the lifting gear lost 2 anchors while attempting to maintain position amidst the harsh Ilulian currents. Tides in this area can fluctuate by up to 15 feet within just 6 hours, and winds often exceed 50 miles per hour. The recovery team was unable to move the Zero because it weighed more than 5,000 pounds and was firmly entrenched in the mud. It seemed as though they had no choice but to abandon their efforts for now. A third recovery team arrived on July 15th with improved equipment, including a portable crane, cables, barge. Working under challenging conditions, icy rain and fog so thick that visibility was limited to just 20 feet, they labored for 2 days. The mud clung to everything like glue. They managed to secure cables underneath the Zero's fuselage, but even then, the crane struggled mightily. The cables pulled the aircraft forward at a leisurely pace. Soon, the Zero started to move. Mud clung desperately to the airframe as it dragged through the muck. A wet, ripping noise echoed as the plane freed itself from the mire. The crew then lifted it into an upright position. Water and mud spilled out of both the cockpit and engine cowling. After allowing everything to drain, they commenced the arduous journey overland towards the coast. Constructing a makeshift road through the marsh was necessary. They placed wooden planks on the ground, facilitating the movement inch by inch. It took them an entire day more to reach the barge. At Dutch harbor, they righted the Zero and removed the worst of the mud. Despite its grim condition, the aircraft appeared salvageable. The plane was then carefully loaded into the cargo hold of the USS Saint Mihiel, a transport ship. Wrapped securely with armed guards posted nearby, nobody could guess what was stored in the hold. On July 20th, the St. Mihiel departed for Seattle, navigating through tumultuous waters for 12 days across the North Pacific. The vessel reached Seattle on August 1st. Following its arrival, the Zero was transported by barge to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, California. This location boasted secure facilities and some of the Navy's most skilled aircraft mechanics. Upon its delivery to North Island on August 12th, the Navy constructed a 12-foot high stockade around it inside a hangar. Armed Marines were stationed there continuously, guarding the perimeter day and night. Access was restricted. Only those with explicit permission from the base commander could approach the aircraft. The fear of souvenir hunters was very real, as even one missing part could jeopardize the entire intelligence operation. The mechanics worked in strict secrecy. Each component removed was meticulously recorded, every measurement documented, and every detail photographed. They carefully straightened the vertical stabilizer while inspecting for metal fatigue. They repaired the rudder to ensure its full range of motion. New wing tips were fabricated to match the original specifications, and they fixed the flaps by testing their hinge points. Replacement landing struts were manufactured to replace those damaged in the crash. Despite the bent 3-blade Sumitomo propeller, it was carefully refurbished and reused. The bullet holes from Dutch Harbor were patched with aluminum inserts, and the aircraft's original red Hinamaru roundel was repainted over with an American blue circle and white star insignia. The repair process spanned 6 weeks of meticulous effort. Exactly 2 months and 16 days after Koga's crash on Akutan Island on September 20, 1942, the restored Zero was ready for its maiden flight. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders would serve as the test pilot. At 31 years old, Sanders had been a Navy test pilot since 1938 and was stationed at Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington. He was renowned for his precision and analytical skills. Unlike showy pilots or aces, Sanders was methodical, understanding intricate aircraft systems, and able to convey detailed insights from the cockpit controls. The Navy required someone who could fly the Zero and gather comprehensive technical data. Sanders fit this role perfectly. On September 20th at 9:03 a.m., Sanders climbed into the Zero's cockpit for the first time. Despite his relatively small stature, even he felt cramped in the tight confines of the cockpit, which was notably smaller than that of a Wildcat. The seat was firm with minimal padding, designed primarily for pilots under 5 feet 8 inches tall. The instrument panel was straightforward compared to American aircraft. Left side featured engine gauges including tachometer and manifold pressure. Center housed essential flight instruments like airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, and turn and bank indicator. Right side displayed fuel gauges and hydraulic pressure. All the markings were in Japanese, which made Sanders feel somewhat disoriented despite his previous efforts to translate them. He located the throttle, mixture control, propeller pitch lever, landing gear handle, and flap controls. Everything was positioned logically but appeared distinct from what he was used to. When Sanders started up the Nakajima Sakai engine, it sputtered once before settling into a steady idle. The noise differed noticeably from that of an American engine, being higher in pitch. As dawn broke on Sunday morning, the propeller's arc could be seen cutting through the air. The aircraft vibrated, though differently than a Wildcat, feeling lighter and more delicate overall. Sanders then checked the gauges. Oil pressure was normal, temperature rising gradually, and fuel pressure was good. He gently increased the throttle. The engine responded instantly without any delay, proving to be responsive and precise. Releasing the brakes, he taxied towards the runway, noting how easily the Zero glided along the ground. The steering of the tail wheel was delicate and responsive, bordering on being overly light, which would require some adjustment to get accustomed to. As Sanders aligned himself with the runway, he smoothly advanced the throttle. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, its lightweight frame contributing to this swift movement. At 60 knots, Sanders gently pulled back on the control stick. The Zero shot upwards into the sky, completing a remarkably short takeoff run, about half the distance needed for a Wildcat. After lifting off, Sanders retracted the landing gear with a firm mechanical click. Next, he raised the flaps and observed as the Zero ascended at an impressively steep angle. Its climb rate was immediately noticeable. The aircraft was climbing over 4,000 feet per minute, possibly closer to 5,000 feet. This performance was truly remarkable. At 5,000 feet, Sanders leveled off and began testing basic handling characteristics. Flying straight and level, he noted that the Zero maintained a steady course with good tracking. The aircraft felt stable overall. Its controls were light yet accurate. When moving slowly, it exhibited remarkable liveliness and responsiveness. A gentle turn initiated by him caused the plane to pivot effortlessly. The low speed roll rate was particularly noteworthy. He reversed direction once more, and the Zero reacted immediately. As Sanders increased the speed, reaching approximately 170 mph or 150 knots, the controls remained light, precise, and responsive. However, at 200 knots, about 230 mph, he noticed a slight stiffening of the ailerons. Further acceleration to 250 knots caused the control surfaces to become rigid and nearly unmovable. Attempting to roll the aircraft required immense effort. Even applying significant force with both hands barely moved the stick, making it seem as though the control surfaces were locked in place. The fabric-covered control surfaces began to balloon from high-speed airflow, rendering them stiff and non-functional for maneuvering. A pilot might exert maximum effort and achieve only a few degrees of bank per second, which was insufficient in combat situations. American pilots flying Wildcats or Corsairs could quickly roll hard right or left at high speeds, whereas a Zero couldn't keep up. Sanders meticulously documented these observations, emphasizing their significance. The dynamics shifted when reaching 200 knots. He rigorously tested the roll rate in both directions and discovered that rolling to the left was easier by about 20%, likely due to engine torque and propeller rotation. Since the engine turned clockwise, as viewed from the cockpit, it generated a rolling moment to the left. With control surfaces made of fabric unable to counteract aerodynamic forces at high speeds, this torque effect became more pronounced. Consequently, a Zero had an advantage when rolling left but was disadvantaged when rolling right. American pilots could leverage this asymmetry. If a Zero was on their tail, they should roll hard to the right, making it even harder for the Zero pilot to follow. Next, Sanders examined negative G maneuvers by climbing to 10,000 feet and initiating a dive, building speed up to 250 knots before sharply pulling back and then pushing forward abruptly to unload the wings, experiencing conditions of Zorgi 1G and 2G. The engine hiccuped and faltered, threatening to shut down completely. Sanders sensed the loss of power instantly. Despite this, the propeller continued spinning aimlessly, generating virtually no forward motion. He lowered the nose to regain positive G forces, and the engine briefly recovered. Attempting it once more yielded identical results. The Zero's engine featured a float-type carburetor that struggled under negative acceleration, failing to maintain adequate fuel pressure. Consequently, the carburetor starved for fuel, causing the engine to stall. An American pilot diving into a steep turn would create enough negative G forces to deprive any pursuing Zero of power, giving him an advantage. This critical flaw had the potential to save numerous lives. Sanders spent 90 minutes on his maiden flight, rigorously testing various maneuvers including climbs, dives, turns, stalls, and slow flight conditions. He meticulously recorded the maximum speed, which was approximately 330 miles per hour, a respectable but not extraordinary figure compared to other aircraft of the era. The Wildcat was nearly as fast, while the upcoming Corsair and Hellcat models would surpass it in speed. He conducted tests on the aircraft's rate of climb, which proved to be remarkable, exceeding 4,000 feet per minute from sea level to 10,000 feet. The Zero could outclimb every American plane in service. He also evaluated the turn radius at different speeds. At lower velocities, the Zero demonstrated exceptionally tight turns, surpassing those of any American fighter aircraft. However, beyond 200 knots, the turn radius significantly widened due to overly heavy controls, making sharp maneuvers difficult. After a 90-minute flight, Sanders landed and shut down the engine. A group of officers and engineers eagerly awaited him near the hangar, eager to hear his findings. Drenched in sweat from his cockpit, with hands trembling from battling the controls at high speeds, he proceeded directly to the commanding officer. His initial statement was straightforward. He had identified critical vulnerabilities that American pilots could leverage against the Zero. Specifically, the ailerons locked up at speeds over 200 knots, and rolling maneuvers became sluggish and required immense effort. Additionally, the aircraft rolled more easily to the left than to the right, and the engine would cut off under negative acceleration. They now possessed concrete, actionable intelligence. From September 20th to October 15th, Sanders conducted 24 test flights. Each flight yielded valuable data. He pitted the Zero against a Wildcat in simulated combat scenarios. The Wildcat pilot attempted every possible maneuver. At slower speeds, the Zero outperformed the Wildcat consistently. It could outmaneuver the Wildcat at any time. However, when the Wildcat employed high-speed tactics like diving attacks and rapid reversals, the Zero struggled to keep up. The roles were reversed entirely. Next, Sanders evaluated the aircraft's armament. The Zero was equipped with two 7.7 mm machine guns in the nose and two 20 mm cannons mounted on its wings. Although the machine guns were rifle caliber, they proved insufficient against American aircraft with armor plating. In contrast, the cannons were highly effective but had limited ammunition, offering only 60 rounds per gun. After a few seconds of firing, the guns would be empty. Additionally, the Zero featured an unusual trigger mechanism mounted on the throttle rather than the control stick, which Sanders found awkward to use. Visibility was another critical aspect he tested. The canopy provided excellent visibility in most directions, surpassing that of a Wildcat. However, there was a significant blind spot directly behind and below the aircraft. The headrest obstructed visibility. An American pilot diving from above could remain hidden until just before impact. Sanders conducted durability tests and found that the Zero's construction was exceptionally lightweight. Its aluminum skin was thinner than American standards, and there was no armor around the cockpit or self-sealing fuel tanks. A few rounds from a .50 caliber machine gun in the right location could cause severe damage. Designed for peak performance rather than longevity, the Zero was highly maneuverable but fragile. Sanders meticulously recorded all observations in his official report. He noted that even the first flight revealed vulnerabilities that American pilots could exploit with appropriate tactics. He detailed issues such as aileron lock at speeds over 200 knots and an asymmetric roll rate. He explained the carburetor malfunction during negative G maneuvers. His recommendations included avoiding turning engagements at low speed, employing diving attacks from altitude to achieve velocities above 250 knots, making one firing pass before climbing back up using their speed and climb rate, and executing negative G dives for evasion. If a Zero got on an American pilot's tail, the advice was to roll sharply right as the Zero would struggle to follow that direction, at approximately 200 knots. The aircraft tended to roll sharply before the pilot could properly aim their sights. Sanders' classified top-secret report was disseminated among fighter squadrons across the Pacific Fleet. However, reading about it and experiencing it firsthand were two different things, leading the Navy to organize live demonstrations. Lieutenant Melvin Hoffman was tasked with flying the Zero in simulated combat against newly trained pilots. As a test pilot stationed at Naval Air Station Anacostia, his call sign was Boogie, and he had been flying Wildcats since 1941. In late October 1942, Hoffman received orders to conduct dogfighting demonstrations using the captured Zero. The Navy aimed to train pilots by exposing them to the actual aircraft they would be combating, thereby illustrating how to exploit Sanders' identified vulnerabilities. These demonstrations took place over San Diego Bay from late 1942 through early 1943, each designed to test particular tactics. The initial demonstration focused on low-speed turning engagements. Hoffman flew the Zero against 4 recently trained Wildcat pilots. Despite employing every known maneuver, the Wildcats found themselves unable to shake off Hoffman's pursuit. The Zero was exceptionally agile at lower speeds, allowing Hoffman to maintain a firing position throughout each turn. One by one, the Wildcats would have been shot down in actual combat. Observing this firsthand, the student pilots grasped the lesson intensely. Avoid engaging a Zero at low speeds, you'll always be at a disadvantage. The second demonstration focused on high-speed diving maneuvers. Wildcat pilots initiated their dives from an altitude of 10,000 feet, while Hoffman started from 5,000 feet in the Zero. As they rolled inverted and dove, the Wildcats quickly accelerated past 250 knots. Despite his efforts, Hoffman found it difficult to match their speed due to the Zero's sluggish roll rate. The students on the ground could see him struggling with the controls. The Wildcats completed their dives, pulled up at 2,000 feet, and climbed back to altitude, leaving Hoffman still trying to get the Zero pointed downward. By the time he managed to turn around, the Wildcats were already climbing away from him. The message was clear: hit the Zero fast and maintain speed. Use your velocity as a weapon. In the third demonstration, the Wildcat pilot allowed Hoffman to get on his tail in the Zero. showcasing the negative G escape maneuver. Hoffman approached within firing range, but from the ground it seemed that the Wildcat was doomed. Suddenly, the Wildcat pilot executed a steep dive and unloaded the aircraft's wings with negative 2 Gs of force. Hoffman attempted to mirror this maneuver. However, the Zero's engine faltered, coughing and sputtering before finally cutting out completely. Black smoke began pouring from the exhaust as the propeller spun aimlessly. Struggling to restart his engine, Hoffman fell behind. Meanwhile, the Wildcat pilot extended his glide range and pulled up, regaining positive G-forces. At that moment, the Zero's engine roared back to life, but was already 2,000 feet away and climbing. The students observed the smoke trail left by Hoffman's aircraft and noted how swiftly the Zero lost its power. They grasped the lesson: if a Zero gets on your tail, push over hard and use negative G-forces. It can't follow. This training regimen continued for months as hundreds of pilots cycled through the program, each one facing off against Hoffman in the captured Zero to witness its vulnerabilities firsthand during actual flight. Every individual picked up the strategies necessary for survival. Those who completed the training frequently discussed their experiences and shared detailed accounts of what they had encountered. They delved into explaining these tactics extensively. By early 1943, news had circulated throughout the Pacific Fleet about the Zero's vulnerabilities, specifically how to exploit them. It was advised not to turn with it at low speeds, to attack from a higher altitude with speed, and to execute sharp right rolls at high velocities. Employing negative G-forces also helped in evading pursuit. These methods proved effective. Marine Corps pilot Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Walsh underwent the training early in 1943. Over the course of World War II, he downed 20 Japanese planes. Reflecting on his career years later, Walsh attributed numerous instances where the Akutan Zero training had safeguarded his life to this experience. He noted that knowing how to handle a Zero pursuing him was crucial and stemmed from insights gleaned from Koga's Zero. Many other pilots concurred with his evaluation. The captured Zero aircraft became invaluable. No previous capture had yielded such critical intelligence during such a dire period. By January 1943, American pilots were achieving unprecedented success rates against Zeros, leaving Japanese command officials astounded. The kill ratio began to change. In July 1942, before the Akutan Zero was tested, there had been 12 Japanese kills for every single American loss. By March 1943, 4 months after training demonstrations commenced, the ratio had nearly evened out. By June 1943, American pilots were inflicting more losses on Zeros than they themselves were suffering. This shift wasn't due to superior aircraft. Although newer planes were arriving, the F-4F Wildcat remained the primary fighter in many squadrons. The change was attributed to increased knowledge and understanding. American pilots had learned how the Zero operated and when it was most vulnerable. They could anticipate a Zero pilot's maneuvers and effectively counter them. Conversely, the Japanese failed to comprehend why their tactics were faltering. These combat techniques, which had been employed since 1937 in China, proved successful at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, and over Burma. Suddenly, around early 1943, these methods no longer worked as expected. American pilots were avoiding turning fights, attacking from higher altitudes with high speed dives, and rolling away at speeds where the Zero could not keep up. The Japanese attempted to adapt but struggled to match the evolving strategies of their opponents. They attempted tighter maneuvers to compel American pilots into slower speed confrontations, yet the Americans refused to engage in such tactics. Instead of turning, they would attack and then retreat by leveraging their superior speed and altitude. Regardless of whatever enticements were presented, the Americans remained unresponsive. Japanese pilots endeavored to close the distance aggressively before the Americans could evade through dives, but American pilots employed negative G maneuvers that seemed to perplex their pursuers. The engines of the Japanese aircraft often faltered during these pursuits, a phenomenon they couldn't explain. while aware of the dangers associated with negative G-forces in general. They lacked specific data on fuel pressure issues and carburetor mechanisms under such conditions. Japanese pilots struggled to adjust for their inferior high speed roll rate by predicting where American fighters would move next. But the Americans' escape directions were erratic and unpredictable. Whether turning left or right, or diving straight down with negative G-forces, there was no discernible pattern that could be exploited. The core issue faced by Japanese pilots was that they were combating an adversary who possessed a deeper understanding of their aircraft than they did themselves. American pilots were well informed about the specific speed at which zero ailerons would lock up at 200 knots and how roll rate degraded asymmetrically. Easier to the left, more challenging to the right. They also comprehended the carburetor problems under negative G-forces, having witnessed demonstrations and practiced countermeasures against them. Japanese pilots possessed a general understanding of their aircraft, recognizing that the Zero performed inadequately at high speeds. However, they lacked crucial numerical data and performance charts that would have highlighted specific vulnerabilities. In contrast, American pilots had access to this vital information. This disparity stemmed from an intact Zero found in a hangar in San Diego, which was gradually turning the tide against Japanese aviators on a daily basis. Japanese intelligence officers meticulously analyzed wreckage from downed American fighters, noting advancements in their aircraft design. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat began service early in 1943 and outperformed the Zero with its superior speed, firepower, and durability. Meanwhile, the Vought F-4U Corsair offered even greater speed and enhanced high-altitude capabilities. Additionally, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning's twin engine configuration allowed it to outmaneuver most opponents at high altitudes. These observations led Japanese analysts to conclude that American aircraft technology had advanced beyond their own. Superior planes were indeed defeating Zero fighters in combat. Yet this conclusion only partially explained the situation. Newer American aircraft undeniably excelled. However, an equally significant factor was the innovative tactics employed by American pilots flying older models like the Wildcat, which also resulted in higher kill rates against Japanese fighters. The strategies proved effective regardless of the type of aircraft used. This knowledge was applicable against all Zeros. On January 12, 1944, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a Marine Corps pilot flying an FF-4U Corsair from Vella, managed to shoot down 5 Zeros during a single mission. He employed high-speed attack tactics derived from the data on the Akutan Zero. These tactics involved diving from altitude and reaching speeds surpassing 250 knots before making a firing pass, then zooming back up to altitude without ever turning or slowing down. This approach prevented the Zero from capitalizing on its superior low-speed maneuverability. Over the following 17 days, Hansen shot down an additional 15 Zeros using these tactics, bringing his total to 20 kills in just 17 days. The once feared Zeros had become easy targets for pilots who understood their weaknesses. By mid-1944, Japanese losses to American fighters were staggering. During the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19 and 2, 1944, approximately 50 Japanese aircraft were lost compared to only 123 American planes. Most of these casualties were Zeros and other carrier-based aircraft. The battle took place over the Philippine Sea near Guam. American fighter pilots flying F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs decimated Japanese formations by exploiting every vulnerability revealed by the Akutan Zero. Experienced Zero pilots who had survived the earlier stages of the war were being killed by American pilots with only a few months of combat experience. It wasn't that the Americans were inherently better pilots, they simply utilized superior tactics. They had access to superior intelligence. The Akutan Zero stayed at North Island throughout 1943 and conducted frequent demonstration flights. By late 1943, it was transported to Washington National Airport, where it was showcased as a war trophy. Curious crowds eagerly queued up to see the aircraft that once instilled fear in Allied forces for 2 years. It now resided in an American hangar, adorned with United States Navy insignia on its fuselage. Photographers from newspapers snapped photos of the Zero, which became a symbol of America's technological espionage and tactical ingenuity. In 1944, the plane was returned to North Island to continue serving as a training aircraft for new pilots. These trainees would engage in mock dogfights against it before deploying to the Pacific Theater. The lessons they learned were consistent: avoid turning against the Zero, attack it with speed, and exploit its vulnerabilities. On February 15, 1945, tragedy struck when the Akutan Zero was destroyed during a training mishap at North Island. As the aircraft was preparing for takeoff, a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver attempting to land lost control. Its landing gear collapsed as it skidded across the runway and collided with the Zero. The still spinning propeller of the Helldiver sliced through the fuselage of the Zero like a saw, effectively cutting it in half. Fuel leaked onto the tarmac following the crash. Both planes were declared total losses. The pilot of the Helldiver sustained only minor injuries but survived. No one was aboard the Zero at that moment, yet a crucial intelligence asset from the Pacific War had vanished. By then, however, it no longer mattered. The Akutan Zero had fulfilled its mission. It had exposed the secrets of the Japanese fighter plane and trained countless pilots. Its impact on the aerial conflict in the Pacific was significant. The information gained would endure indefinitely. William Thies, the PBY pilot who spotted the aircraft on July 10, 1942, lived through the war. He continued flying patrol missions throughout the Illusion campaign and later in the Central Pacific. His duties included submarine patrols, search and rescue operations, and anti-shipping strikes. He retired from naval service in 1946 with the rank of lieutenant commander, but never received formal recognition for his discovery. Although his name appears in operational reports, he was never awarded for finding the Zero. Weiss passed away in 1989 at age 73. His obituary noted his career as a patrol pilot but did not mention this pivotal achievement. Albert Knack, the machinist mate who first sighted the Zero from the PBY window, continued to serve in the Pacific until the war's end. He participated in many patrol and rescue missions during that time. Post-war, he returned home to Michigan and worked as an automotive mechanic. He seldom mentioned spotting the Zero, considering it merely part of his routine patrol duties. Like many others, he had witnessed numerous crashed planes and didn't realize that this particular crash would have a significant historical impact. Knack passed away in 1994 at the age of 78. Robert Kerms, who led the initial recovery team and gave Koga a respectful burial on Akutan, continued his service in the Pacific Theater. He participated in amphibious operations in both the Gilbert Islands and Marinas before being promoted to lieutenant commander and taking on responsibilities as a salvage operations officer. Following the war, he worked in commercial shipping but was unaware of the full significance of the Zero that he had helped recover. To him, it was just one among many salvage missions undertaken during the conflict. Kerms died in 2001 at the age of 86. Eddie Sanders, who flew the Akutan Zero on its inaugural American flight as a test pilot, went on to have an illustrious career. He participated in combat missions over the Pacific, testing new aircraft and training pilots for their roles. After the war, he remained with the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of Rear Admiral. During the Cold War era, Sanders was involved in anti-submarine warfare development, focusing on tactics and technology to counter Soviet submarines. Though rarely discussing the Akutan Zero publicly, its test flights were classified information for many years. When historians finally interviewed him in the 1980s, Sanders described the aircraft as remarkable at low speeds but noted its evident limitations at high altitudes. He emphasized that American pilots could effectively exploit these shortcomings once they understood them fully. Sanders passed away in 1998 at the age of 87. Melvin Hoffman, who led dogfighting demonstrations, later achieved the rank of Rear Admiral. Throughout World War II, he trained numerous pilots in anti-Zero tactics. Post-war, he held various command positions and contributed significantly to the evolution of jet fighter strategies as aircraft transitioned from propeller-driven to jet-powered. Hoffman emphasized that a captured Zero played an indispensable role in Navy training during the Pacific conflict. He noted that witnessing the Zero's vulnerabilities firsthand was equivalent to receiving thousands of intelligence reports. Hoffman himself died in 2003 at 87 years old. John Thatch, known for developing the beam defense strategy later called the Thatch wave, eventually reached full admiral status. Throughout the war, he continuously improved fighter tactics. When Japan introduced kamikaze attacks towards the end of 1944, Thatch devised the Big Blue Blanket defense system, a multi-layered fighter patrol method that effectively countered suicide aircraft. Following World War II, Thatch served as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air and subsequently held the position of Commander in Chief of United States Naval Forces Europe before retiring in 1967. When queried about the most critical tactical innovation during the Pacific War, Thatch invariably highlighted the captured Zero. He pointed out that the aircraft was enigmatic until its capture at Akutan. Afterward, it became just another plane with comprehensible traits and exploitable flaws. Thatch passed away in 1981 at age 76. Tadayoshi Koga's remains were interred on Akutan Island until their exhumation by the American Graves Registration Service in 1947. This service conducted exhaustive searches for battlefield and crash site burials across the Pacific. They discovered Koga's grave near Akutan and relocated his remains to Adak Island Cemetery, where they joined other Japanese war casualties recovered from the region. In 1953, the Adak Cemetery underwent excavation, leading to the repatriation of 236 Japanese bodies back to Japan. Out of these, only 13 were identified by name, while the remaining 223, including Koga, were reburied as unknown soldiers at Chidori, Gafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. Koga's family remained unaware of his fate, knowing only that he had been killed near a place called Illusions and had no grave to visit or body for burial. It wasn't until the 1980s that researchers uncovered information about Koga's final resting place. In 1988, American author Jim Reardon and Japanese businessman Minoru Komoto conducted extensive research into Koga's circumstances. They discovered his original burial site on Akutan was now empty, but found records indicating he had been among the unidentified remains repatriated in 1953. Reardon later penned a comprehensive account of the Akutan Zero, detailing its capture and impact on the war. Japanese historians learned about the significance of the aircraft long after the conflict ended. Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, a former Imperial Navy pilot turned military historian, studied intelligence failures. He concluded that the loss of an intact Zero was nearly as damaging to Japan as the Battle of Midway. According to him, losing one such aircraft cost Japan hundreds of pilots and thousands of lives because American pilots quickly learned how to counter every advantage the Zero offered. Military historians have described the Akutan Zero as a treasure of immen to the United States and likely one of the greatest intelligence prizes of the intelligence states of the Pacific War. Fragments from this historic plane can still be found in various museums. William Leonard, an aviation machinist who witnessed the 1945 collision that destroyed the aircraft, salvaged several gauges and instruments before they were removed. He held on to these items for decades before donating them to the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C., where they are now on display with a plaque explaining their history. In Anchorage, the Alaska Heritage Museum houses fragments of aluminum skin and a section of the control stick from the Akutan Zero. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum holds additional small pieces, such as part of the instrument panel, but most of the aircraft was scrapped in 1945. There is no complete airframe left anywhere, only remnants and photographs serve as tangible evidence of this pivotal plane that altered the course of the Pacific War. One photograph within the San Diego Air and Space Museum's archives has Eddie Sanchez taxiing the Zero on September 20, 1942, shortly before its initial test flight. The aircraft appears immaculate in the image, with fresh paint and clear American markings visible, the rising sun insignia replaced by white stars on blue circles. Sanders can be seen in the cockpit with a serious and focused expression while mechanics and guards surround the plane, observing what would soon become history. Another photograph in the National Archives depicts the Zero being lifted from Akutan Island's muddy terrain in July 1942. Navy personnel stand around the aircraft, which is still covered in mud, its tail pointing upward. Cables are attached underneath the fuselage to assist with the lift. This picture captures the moment when one of World War II's most valuable intelligence assets was finally freed from the bog, where it had been trapped for 36 days. Intelligence victories often occur through unexpected circumstances. While elaborate spy networks and code-breaking efforts play crucial roles, sometimes they stem from a pilot deviating off course due to adverse weather conditions or a damaged aircraft making an emergency landing on an unimportant island. 2 enemy pilots were unable to bring themselves to destroy their friend's aircraft. Koga's wingmen, Endo and Shikada, disobeyed direct orders by leaving the Zero intact on Akutan. They were well aware of the potential repercussions, as they had been thoroughly briefed on the critical importance of destroying any downed Zero that might fall into enemy hands. The presence of an undamaged aircraft in American possession would have been devastating for Japan's war efforts. However, their sense of camaraderie overrode their duty. They couldn't bear to strafe a plane that might still contain their comrade. This moment of compassion and fundamentally human decision had severe consequences for Japan's air superiority, which it had maintained since December 1941. With one intact Zero, the meticulous analysis conducted by a test pilot, along with a series of training demonstrations, American pilots quickly gained comprehensive knowledge about the aircraft. They understood its strengths and weaknesses, knew the specific speeds at which the Zero became vulnerable, and learned how to roll in certain directions to escape pursuing fighters. Additionally, they discovered that applying negative G-forces could disable an enemy Zero's engine. This newfound intelligence transformed American pilots from victims into skilled hunters. Despite Japan continuing to rely on the Zero as its primary fighter aircraft until the end of the war, due to a lack of industrial capacity to design and produce a viable replacement. The Zero had become obsolete by 1945. This was not due to Japanese engineers failing to improve the plane, but because American pilots had studied it thoroughly, understood every aspect, and used that knowledge to dominate the skies over the Pacific for the last 3 years of the war. If you found this narrative as captivating as we did, please consider liking this video. It aids in uncovering lesser-known tales from World War II. Join our list to stay informed about these hidden narratives. Every story highlights how ordinary people, driven by instinct or empathy, shaped history. We would also appreciate hearing from you. Feel free to share your location in the comments section below. Our audience includes individuals from all continents, ranging from those who witnessed these events firsthand to newcomers exploring them for the first time. Thanks for tuning in and helping preserve these accounts.